Hello, my name is Dawn Bueller. I am the Kansas Riverkeeper and Executive Director of Friends of the Kaw, and I'm here today to talk to you about making the connections, climate change, and water in Kansas. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Friends of the Kaw. We are a nonprofit dedicated to protecting and preserving the 173-mile-long Kansas River. For over 29 years, our water-focused Friends group has been the only grassroots conservation group dedicated to protecting the Kansas River. Our members come from rural, urban, and suburban areas and represent canoers, kayakers, fisherfolk, hunters, bird watchers, and locals who love the river. When we formed in 1991, the river was almost completely inaccessible to the public. We changed all that by increasing the number of boat ramps from 6 to 19 and leading paddle trips on the Kansas River to teach people about the river. Since 2001, Friends of the Kaw has been a member of the Global Waterkeeper Alliance, and we sponsor the Kansas Riverkeeper as an advocate to represent Friends of the Kaw and the Kansas River on every major stakeholder group. I serve as your Kansas Riverkeeper and as a non-governmental public advocate. This is accomplished through holding the community accountable for the health of the river, working to resolve pollution concerns about the river, advocating for the Kansas River and its environs, educating the public, and providing outreach activities to get people involved. Climate change in many ways is a water story. Most of the impacts of climate change touch some aspect of water affecting agriculture, ecosystems, fisheries, drinking water, energy, health, and it even highlights our problems with an aging infrastructure throughout our community's many wastewater treatment plants. Water is always on the move. If you think about water, you can think of the various forms of water, from rain to snow to ice, and it's always moving in what we call the water cycle. The water cycle is the pattern in which water circulates between the Earth's oceans, atmosphere, and land. This process involves these forms of water as precipitation, draining in our watersheds to our streams and rivers. Our influences on the water cycle will cause more intense droughts and precipitation. With higher than average temperatures and warmer air, which holds more water, we will have a pattern of lengthy droughts interspersed with heavy downpours of precipitation and flooding. We know that droughts, intense rains, and floods occur naturally, but climate change is exacerbating these events. This change to our water cycle greatly impacts the watersheds in which we live, which impacts the aquatic environments and our drinking water supply. Climate change has also contributed to the increase in harmful algal blooms due to warmer water bodies combined with nutrient pollution that are worsened by the drought and deluge cycle. Why is understanding watersheds important to climate change? First, the increases in surface temperatures will impact the water cycle, which in turn impacts the entire watershed system. Changes in the variability of flow and the amount of pollution in our rivers have important implications on water quality, water quantity, and ecosystems in the watershed. So let's start off with, what is a watershed? A watershed is an area of land from which all water drains to a single point, such as a creek, a small river, a lake, or a wetland. And if you live in eastern Kansas, this would be the Kansas River. No matter where you live in the world, you live in a watershed. So how do watersheds work? Watersheds are like stacking cups. So with one small one inside of a larger one. The Kansas River is 61,000 square miles, and it sits within the Missouri watershed, which is 525,000 square miles. This area then sits within the Mississippi River watershed, which is 1.83 million square miles. And all of this area drains to the Gulf of Mexico. For context, you're going to see a picture of the Kansas River watershed. It covers almost the entire upper half of Kansas, central Nebraska, and eastern Colorado. So simply put, any precipitation that falls in this area will ultimately drain to the Kansas River if we don't divert it or use it for some other purpose. River water and reservoir water are intimately connected in Kansas. There are 18 federal reservoir projects that affect 85% of the Kansas River drainage area. So if we look at 2019 as an example, we received 51 inches of rain in eastern Kansas compared to the average of 38 inches. All of this rain was mostly stored in our federal reservoirs, watershed lakes, and filled our rivers and streams beyond their capacity. To put the rain into context, the Kansas River floodplain, which is the area in which a river will flood out of its riverbanks, is historically up to 4 miles wide around the town of Wamego and narrows as it moves downstream towards the Missouri River. If we would not have had our federal reservoirs for flood control in 2019, all of our communities along the Kansas River would have been underwater up to 4 miles wide. I don't know about you, but that would have included my home as well. Watersheds are an important consideration in the climate change discussion. Watersheds are all about how water moves. The essence of watershed management is the capture, storage, and beneficial release of water. In order to plan for impacts of climate change on our water resources, we must prepare our watersheds. This means finding ways to slow down the runoff and allow for infiltration. Filter the water from pollutants and give our land time to slowly release the water downstream. So why is the understanding of watersheds so important to the climate change discussion? Well, as we've discussed, the slowing of water to allow the land to filter pollutants and water to infiltrate is very important. Additionally, it is important to think about all of the uses of water, such as drinking water supply, energy production, manufacturing, wastewater treatment plants, and many more uses. All of these community uses rely upon water, and by better managing our watersheds, we can make sure that we have the quantity and the quality that we need in the face of climate change. There are multiple ways that climate impacts our communities. Increase in flooding and drought that impacts our livelihood, our economy, our agriculture, and our community health. And we did see many of these impacts in 2019. Bomb cyclone storm systems, which are often a new term for many of us, that created flooding and drought that impact life and property. Again, we saw those in 2019. Water quality of our rivers and streams from pollution in the watershed and moving sediment, because sediment carries with it nutrients that impact the water quality. These have impacts to ecosystem and to aquatic life. The community infrastructure, such as wastewater treatment plants and drinking water systems, those are impacted by climate change. And the impacts to recreation and livelihood and how those impact our health. Now let's discuss this example of how climate change impacts water and communities. If you look at the next slide, CO2 is released into the atmosphere, which creates energy in the atmosphere, which disrupts this precipitation balance. This in turn increases flood and drought conditions, which in turn increases the costs for treatment and infrastructure, such as to our wastewater treatment systems. An example of this is that in 2019, the city of Lawrence experienced an 11-inch rainfall in a few hours. This influx of rainwater in the wastewater treatment system facility caused hardware to break, which caused the plant to shut down and send raw sewage into the Kansas River. These are the types of scenarios that will continue to play out if we don't address these real climate-related impacts to our water resources. Our communities need to prepare for the financial and health impacts of a varying climate. We depend on a reliable, clean, drinking water to sustain our health. In closing, let's bring this back to our local waterway. Over 800,000 Kansans get their drinking water from the Kansas River, and this water supply is greatly impacted by climate change. We saw the very real impacts in 2019 with bomb cyclones that moved across Kansas and the upper Midwest, melting snow melt that flooded the Missouri River and caused Kansas to hold water in our reservoirs for far too long. And then a flooded Kansas River for most of the year, which has had wide-ranging implications to our communities, farmers, recreationists, and every single person or business that relies upon the Kansas River. We must prepare now for the next big flood or drought, which the long-range climate predictions say it's coming sooner than we want. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has already predicted that spring 2020 will be another year of potential flooding caused by higher than average snow across the upper Midwest and rainfall across the region. The time to plan is now. So what can you do? First, you can stay engaged and stay informed. Second, join us and sign the Climate Health Declaration at resilientkansas.org. And lastly, stay engaged with Friends of the Caw via our newsletter, our website, and our social media. Thank you for watching today, and please join us in protecting our water resources.